for being here. For those who arrived after our first day, welcome. It is a tremendous pleasure to be involved with a program with this caliber of contributors, and I don't just mean our plenary speakers. The contributed sessions I've attended have all been magnificent, so it's for me already been a tremendous education and a very rewarding experience. But of the many rewards we've had to offer, this is a very special moment and a very special session. It's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce someone who needs no introduction, Ruth Millikan. It's sometimes said that philosophy of mind has two major problems. One of them is the problem of consciousness, and the other is the problem of intentionality. I don't know about democracy, but I think if you were to take a vote among analytic philosophers today about the latter question, intentionality, the consensus view would be that Ruth Millikan basically solved this problem around 1984 and has continued to fine-tune her ideas in ways that have been leading thought in the field since that time. So tremendous impact on our profession, for which we're all grateful. Ruth is author of 6 books. Is that a 6? And yeah, oh right, and then as well as a book of responses to very, I think, damaging responses to her feeble critics. I say as a critic in that volume. As well as many very influential articles, some of which have been translated into more languages than they have in New Guinea. So with no further delay, we're about 10 minutes off in our sequence, so we'll just shift accordingly. We'll begin with a talk titled, a talk that needs no title. Widening direct reference to general terms. I present Ruth Millikan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, I'm not going to talk directly about direct reference at all. What I'm going to do is something that's much more germane to this conference, I guess. What I'm going to really do is to try to argue that there are no such things as empirically based concepts. There are no concepts, empirically based concepts. I mean, if there's a concept of and or, that's not a matter I'm not concerned with, but empirically based concepts. And I want to say something about what I think there are instead. But I'm going to have to start by, I'm going to have to integrate 4 things. I'm going to talk to you about what I think the structure of the world is like that makes language possible. I'm going to talk to you about how I think words connect with that world. And then I'm going to talk to you about ideas, which will be what I'm going to give you in place of concepts. And then about the way the world connects with ideas through the world. So that's going to be the sequence. So start by imagining a huge multidimensional graph on which the various individuals in the world have all been represented by points. Actually, it better be fuzzy points, so they have some extension, I guess. So each dimension corresponds to a different property continuum. Consider at the start just physical properties, but I think that the point I'm going to make will generalize obviously and totally, easily, totally. All right, so in this graph, there's a dimension for weight, and there's a dimension for volume, and there are dimensions for various electromagnetic reflectance properties, and there's a dimension for temperature, and a set of dimensions that effectively describe shape. Actually, I think that's mathematically impossible. We'll let that go. But there are dimensions for amounts of each material constituent, dimensions for flexibility, malleability, viscosity, granularity, and so anything you can think of. So imagine this multidimensional graph to have dimensions large enough that each possible physical object in the world could be fully described by merely locating its position on this graph. Again, I say, ignore the likely logical impossibility of this. It's really not going to matter. The image, they never call this an intuition problem, I guess. It's the image, I think you'll see as a valid image. All right, what I want you to notice is this. First, when every object there actually is had been represented by a properly located dot on that graph, all but a vanishingly small proportion of that graph would remain empty space. That's because nearly every arbitrary list of logically compatible properties that could exhaustively describe an object fails to describe any real object. Second, where the graph is not empty, there would be various large clusters of points in close proximity along many dimensions of the space. Say there would be all the rabbits, or all the Gothic cathedrals, or all the McDonald's restaurants, or all the tablespoons, right? They would be, for the most part, they would have huge spaces between them, these clusters. There were these little clusters and then huge spaces between them. That in these clusters, that is, that these clusters would mostly neither fade into one another, nor would there be wisps of close points bridging from one cluster to another. There will not be any compact conduits leading by any route, say, from Kermit the Frog, or from anything in his immediate vicinity, to the Eiffel Tower, or to my writing desk, or even to Tabby, or even to Toady the Toad, right? Something as close as that. So there's no way you could imagine changing even Toady such that there are actual things that are nearby each of the stages of the change, right? The world then is mostly filled with clusters of objects, densely interlocked properties that are pretty distinctly, if not always perfectly separated from one another. All right, well, so why is that so? Why are so many things so much like other things, with their properties clustering together, yet distancing themselves from other such clusters? Why is logical space clotted in that manner? There are, of course, reasons such as causal necessities and natural incompatibilities, which are going to make some kinds of objects impossible, right? Physically impossible. But there's another important reason. First, much that has happened to find its way into our world simply persists, of course, in accordance with conservation laws. Other things cycle, or they get copied, or they get reproduced. The Earth persists, and it rotates, cycling, causing cyclical daily patterns, and it circles around the persisting sun. It causes cyclical yearly patterns, cyclical weather patterns, and cyclical patterns in plant life and animal behaviors accordingly. So animals and plant species persistently reproduce. Their forms are stabilized by homeostasis in the gene pool and in the environment. Artifacts that work well or that please people, they are reproduced. Songs and stories, colored eggs at Easter time, screwdrivers, steeples on churches, these are all numerously reproduced, copied from each other. So the world contains a limited variety. I mean, this is a way of trying to understand why there's limited variety, which, of course, the fact that there's a limited variety is what the possibility of induction rests on, as we've known for a long time, since Keynes and before that, Mill. The world exhibits limited variety in large part because those things that happen to be so constructed that they endure, in other words, there's just their inner constitution is such that they endure, they stay in the world, or then there are other things that recur, and of course then they keep recurring in the world, or multiplying, keep reproducing in the world. And what happens is that then that uses up the resources that might otherwise have been used to make things of a different kind. It's a very elementary notion from biology, actually. But I think it applies generally. It doesn't apply just to species. It applies very generally. Okay. All right, but that picture is in a way too simple. Babies do slowly grow up and they become adults. They change, they age, and they become dead. Older species Older species have evolved into newer species. Older computers have evolved very quickly into newer computers, second generation, third generation, and so forth. Romanesque churches evolved into Gothic churches. 1890s fashion evolved into 1900s and the 1910s fashions. Some diseases have central paradigm cases, but there are others that may exhibit several separate syndromes with a good number of outliers between. So the clumps in nature often are not entirely clearly separated. Nor are they, as it were, what shall I say? The clumps, if you think of them as being a graph, the clumps are not spherical or, n-dimensional spherical. But rather they are of many different shapes. They're elongated. Think of the computers since 1950. One like the next, like the next, like the next. You can't see any relation at all between the one at this end and the one at that. Right? Elongated, worm-like, branching. They have points and ridges, sometimes in bulges and projections of every shape imaginable. And there are sets of smaller clots or clusters that are often arranged into clusters of clusters. And then there are clusters of clusters of clusters, themselves coming in a variety of shapes, forming species, family, and phyla. Right. There are reasons for these clusterings. Causal principles that explain why the items in a particular cluster are alike in the ways they are. That is, they explain why, given that some members of the cluster have the properties they do, other members have come to have those properties too. That is why I prefer to speak of these, sometimes call these clots instead of clusters, because the members of these clots are, it's like they were glued or stuck together. They're actually causally connected with each other. So a good comparison, and this is one that I want to return to because I think it's fundamental, is among the parts of what philosophers would call temporal parts or time parts of an individual. The way the time parts of an individual are connected together, they are certainly in a way glued together, right? Each one causes the next one. Or consider the temporal parts of an organization, right? They're cause each other, etc. So the various temporal parts of any given individual object lie contiguously in a vector space of the kind it's suggested. With each individual temporal part cluster, with each cluster which is an individual, a cluster of time stage parts, which equals an individual, those parts in one cluster are glued together, but the one cluster that constitutes one individual of a type is separated from another individual. So there's a space. There'll be a space between them. So that's analogous to the way in which, say, species are separated from one another. As a matter of fact, many of you may be aware of the very well-known analogy that's been used recently between species and individuals in biology. That there are very good reasons to sometimes think of species as being almost individuals. They have many similarities to individuals. All right. So there are, of course, many dimensions in which the members or temporal stages of a clot differ widely from one another. Indeed, frequently there are no features at all that characterize every single member of a cluster, unless those features characterize members of many quite separate clusters as well. There are, for example, no genes that every human has in common with every other gene, unless they are shared by members of many other species as well. We have no peculiarly human genes that everybody has. These clots, that is, are not the sorts of things that could be picked out by a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. There are no necessary conditions. Like individuals, these clots do not have definitions. This is going to be very important. They don't have definitions. Equally important, there are usually many different properties or small sets of properties that are each reliable signs, if not always infallible signs, of membership in a certain clot. There are very many reliable ways of telling that something is a member of the cat clot, by its shape and any of many postures, viewed from many different angles, by its movements and its behaviors, or its bones if you're a paleontologist, or its blood if you're a veterinarian, right? Or its purrs, or if you're unlucky, the smell of its urine or the sound of its caterwauls, right? Similarly, and going back to the analogy with individuals, I can tell each of my daughters from the front, from the back, from any other angle, from near, from far, by their characteristic gestures or ways of walking, by their voices in the room or over the phone, by their handwriting, by many of their activities, by the kinds of requests they make of me, by any of hundreds of descriptions of them, many ways that I can tell when I'm getting information about one of my daughters. All right, that was about individuals and what I call real kinds. So next is about words. Words of the kind I'm talking about, these are what we normally call these words stood for empirical concepts, but it's exactly the notion of a concept that I want to withdraw, because I'll tell you why. Words are anchored to clots. A word anchored to a clot, I will argue, carries only a direct reference to the clot. It's the name of the clot, just like the name of an individual, which it carries no particular description of that clot with it. The name of a clot carries no distinguishing information about the clot, nor when it is tokened about the area of the clot the item so named is to be found in. The name carries no public information specific to its extension. So you ask, how then are the names of clots anchored? How does a name get together with its proprietary clot? How do words get conventionally attached to their extensions? There are two sides to this question. One of them concerns, I think, the question of linguistic conventions. So I'll say a word about that. David Lewis told us that following linguistic conventions, he took it that languages following, learning languages, learning to follow conventions, and I follow this. I believe this is true. According to him, following linguistic conventions is a matter of following precedent. But here's David Lewis's description of following a precedent, which he takes us to be an essential ingredient in following a convention. He says, of course we could never be given exactly the same coordination problem again. Exactly the same problem to solve. The linguistic conventions solve coordination problems for Lewis, also for me. He says, we cannot do exactly what we did before. Nothing we could do this time is exactly like what we did before, like it in every respect, because the situations are not exactly like. So guided by whatever analogy we notice, we tend to follow precedent. There might be alternative analogies. If so, there is room for ambiguity about what would be following precedent and what we did before. In fact, there are always innumerable alternative analogies. Were it not that we happen uniformly to notice some analogies and ignore others, precedents would be completely ambiguous and worthless. But applied to linguistic conventions, the problem that's posed here by Lewis is a broader form of the problem that's sometimes been called by linguists the poverty of the stimulus. And that's the problem that helped to prod Chomsky to the conclusion that there must be something like a universal grammar module that tightly channels a child's interpretation of the syntactic precedents that the child encounters. Similarly, in linguists from Lakoff to Jackendorf at least, constraints on semantic interpretation have often been assumed to be determined by peculiarities of the human cognitive system, how the mind deals with the word. All right, whatever truth there may or may not be in those speculations, what I want to propose here is that at least a large part of the semantic side of the Lewis problematic, how do we all manage to go on in the same way, right, can be relieved by an examination of the clumping features of the actual world. The clumps form centers of gravity to attract reuse of the same word, producing natural patterns in the channel's perceived analogy. The configuration of clumpings within clumpings of the existence of vague and narrow conduits between clumpings, the way in which these clumpings are sometimes many-branched or extravagantly elongated, that is crucial for accounting for the way in which the semantic conventions of a language have both a tendency to run roughly in roughly defined channels and also a tendency to slip between channels, continuing to serve communication well, but at the same time continuing to drift and to diverge. Language is always a bit restless. The problem here is that language is digital, but the world is not quite. The world does offer a purchase, but only a slippery purchase to language. The world clumps, but then there are sometimes unclear divisions between the clumps, ways of getting from one clump to another through narrow ways, clumps within clumps, so the world doesn't make it all that clear. Just why language can slip sometimes. Language is constantly changing. Yeah. Names for clots are anchored to the gravitation by the gravitational forces that these clots exert as wholes, or they are anchored to bumps or ridges or projections on these clots that have, as it were, their own centers of gravity. Conversely, the function of these names is not to impose boundaries. This I think is very important. Think of words, they're not supposed to cut like a classification set between all the possible cases. So you could take your word over to any possible world and decide what was on one side and what was on the other side of the boundaries of the word. That's just, I want to say, how language does not work. Rather, the linguistic words are attracted to the center of a clump, right? They do not carve up logical space into discrete portions. They are names for clots in historical space and time. Because they name structures in historical space-time, their extensions possess boundaries only insofar as the clots they are anchored to have natural boundaries, only insofar as there's a pretty determinate or edge to the clots. And insofar as there isn't, the words become vague. The clots do not have sharp natural boundaries. There will usually be nothing if the clots do not have natural sharp boundaries, the world does not have natural sharp boundaries, then there will be nothing to give the words sharp boundaries. When the clots shade into each other, fewer or more cases seeming to rest within either or both of two clots, then the words for them will tend to drift as well. Words may also find passages through various necks and to nearby clots, or they may extend to the whole of a containing clot, as when cat is used to cover bigger cats, like lions and tigers. Or they may slowly creep along the length of a rod-shaped clot. The names sometimes shift in their usage over time. All right, nothing strictly determines for these words, then, what is literal use. Of course, sometimes words will have been artificially enclosed for some reason, as when cases have to come, as it were, before the law. I mean, there are times when, for moral and legal reasons, we need to arbitrarily put some boundaries on words. But that's rare. The overwhelming tendency is for words to range freely from within a clot, sometimes finding passages into nearby clots, sometimes extending them to the whole of a wider containing clot. What the hearer will probably find probable, given the context of use and his prior knowledge, is the main principle guiding usage. All right, I'm going to say that was, so far, I only talked about individuals and kinds, what I call real kinds. So I'm going to say a word about properties before I go on, about words for properties. The words for properties All right. I think that once again, it is the structure of the actual world that provides purchase for anchoring our terms for properties. A contrary space of properties generally has many possible anchoring points within it. Some of these are described by using modifiers such as pure, perfect, absolute, complete, total, and so forth. So we have pure water, a pure tone, perfectly straight, a perfect fifth, absolutely empty, completely impermeable, totally bald, exactly circular, and so forth, right? These are endpoints. These are natural peaks, I want to call them, arrived at when approaching often from any of various property directions. Anchoring peaks may also be dependable features of clots that exist contingently, of just historical clots. Say clots that happen to exist in the world of the language community. So we have a term like pear-shaped for a shape. We have peach, meaning a color. We have words like furry, which is a general adjective, but of course it comes from the stuff fur. Bony, lemony, waxy. See, all of those are anchoring points because there's a stuff that has a very definite, that we can point to that has a very definite property that sort of holds that property for us. All right, anchoring points sometimes may also depend on peculiarities of the human perceptual systems, and color seems to be an example of the basic color words in the various languages are added to languages in a definite order, or very close. Some languages have 2 colors, some have 3, some have 4. And the order in which they're added corresponds very closely to the order, to the height, say, of natural peaks in discrimination distance, how many discriminations you can make from neutral gray. In other words, how many discriminations the human visual system can make in order to how many just, you know, I can just barely see the differences in how many you can see. You can see more of those going out to red than you can to reddy orange, and that makes red a point. All right, adjectives and adverbs are anchored in this manner. Adjectives and adverbs that are anchored in this manner have no definite boundaries. They are used to describe whatever is close enough to the exact point that they are anchored to for the communication needs of the moment. The proliferation of these words has not depended on use within any set distance from these peaks. Useful closeness will always depend on context, so that, say, the blue square one in one context might not be the blue square one in the next context where there was something that was bluer and squarer. Right? But the set of actual historical applications that have helped account for the proliferation of a peak-anchored term, that is, the precedence for its use, these will have a certain statistical properties, but no cutoff points. I'd love to go off and say something about the irrelevance of Sorites paradoxes at this point, but I won't. I mean, if this is right, then Sorites paradoxes are just an error about how language actually works. All right, it remains to explain how names get anchored in the mind to their property peaks, or to their property clots or peaks in property space. How do we articulate a direct reference analysis to names for clots or property clots for individuals? And what exactly does the language itself give you, if not information about what is being talked about? All right, so it's now time finally for my promised excursion into the philosophy of mind. Right? For how language works depends on how thought works. It depends on those clumps and peaks, how they are grasped by the mind. That is, it depends on our ideas of them and the like. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. All right, words I've said are hooked onto clots and peaks. Ideas are also hooked into clots and peaks. But I will argue different people's ideas are hooked onto those clots and peaks in different ways. Your language does not carry with it any particular ways of hooking onto the clumps and peaks to which it refers. That is done completely idiosyncratically by each language user. Thus it is that the world itself is essential and dramatically involved at every level in linking language to a hearer's understanding of what is signified by that language. All right, let me unpack that. All right. So I remarked above on the diverse ways in which I'm able to recognize each of my daughters. And of course, this goes for lots of other people too. I can recognize them in many diverse ways. So let me list more ways, at the same time generalizing to include any sort of way that I have of identifying information that is arriving in my senses, at my senses, as information about the same person. All right, I can recognize any person I know well in any of many bodily postures, sitting, standing, lying down, yawning, stretching, running, eating, holding still, half hidden behind an object, under extremely diverse lighting conditions, through a fog, in a photograph, on TV, through binoculars, by their voices over the telephone, by their voices through a wall, by their voices underwater, incidentally, you can recognize, or through masking sounds such as wind or rain or other people talking and so forth. Signs by which I may identify information coming about another person may also include their signature, their handwriting, their style of prose or humor. I know exactly who it was that cracked that joke. That was my nephew, if someone repeats it. And it also includes recognizing their names when someone talks about them, or when those names are written by hand or in different fonts. And it includes recognizing these people also through often many hundreds of descriptions. Certainly for my daughter, you could say thousands of descriptions that I would be able to recognize them through. I might also recognize whom the information is about using various kinds of inference, induction, or abduction. I think I probably have equally many different ways of identifying incoming information hitting my senses, about a dog as such, or a cat as such. And so for a very large collection of real kinds, that is, I can recognize the members of many of the various clots that I described above in that way. No particular way that I recognize them. I have many different ways of recognizing this is a member of the clot. And you may have many others. I'll get to that. I can also recognize many properties, say shapes or colors or distances under a wide variety of conditions. So think of the variety of proximal visual stimulations. That is what actually hits the eye, to which a given shape may give rise when viewed from various angles, from different distances, under different lighting conditions, through various media, such as mist or water, when colored different ways, when partially occluded. How shape constancy is achieved by the visual systems, that is, the capacity to recognize the same three-dimensional shape as the same in a wide range of proximal stimulation conditions, that is a problem of enormous complexity. And shape is also identified, of course, by the haptic systems, by the feeling. You can feel a shape with these fingers or those. You can feel it when the object is turned this way or that, perhaps by using two hands, by merely holding the object, or by actively feeling and stroking it, by exploring with larger portions of your body that include your arms, if it's a larger body, say. Perhaps having to use your legs, exploring the shape of a room with blindfolds on. You can do this. Similarly, the variety of ways in which color constancy, texture constancy, size constancy, place constancy, distance constancy, sound constancy, phoneme constancy, and that's a very interesting one. The way these are achieved, these are enormously complicated matters. And one may also receive information about properties through the use of all kinds of measuring instruments, scopes, and through the use of many styles of inference. So you possess a great number of complex, extraordinarily versatile cognitive skills, each being a capacity to gather into one focus innumerable small bits of natural information, all of which happen to concern the very same object, or real kind or property, where this object had been widely scattered over time and place through diverse media to arrive at your sensory surfaces in the form of a hugely diverse set of proximal stimulations. You have the amazing ability to bring together these scattered bits of information to bear on one another via immediate inference and practical learning over time, and to use the results during later encounters when you recognize more information coming in about the same thing. As input methods, you may use the most direct kind of perception, or perception through instruments, or observation through signs of many kinds, and inference of many types. I should remind you, too, that direct perception is perception through signs, right? I mean, it's not as though that's not perception through signs, the light that hits your eyes, you're perceiving. All right, none of these single methods that you are able to recognize an object or a property, none of those defines the object of your thought. None of them is definitional. Your steady or more wobbly focus, when taken together, is all there is to do that, to define that. If there is no clear focus, if as a matter of fact you are identifying different things as though they were one thing, then your thought is to that degree confused or equivocal. And this can happen. You have two people confused. I often get two students confused. Right. All right. I have recently decided, I've recently coined the term unicept for the mental neural system that brings the information concerning a single object or property or relation or real kind into a single focus. The uni, of course, is for one, right? And the sept is Latin capro, it's the same as for concept, and that means to take or to hold. So a unicept for an object, property, kind, or relation, a unicept takes in many proximal stimulations, holds them as one distal thing. Many different ways of recognizing that it's the same thing again. A unicept integrates identification methods. It's same tracks, right? It funnels information about the same into storage in a way that marks it as concerning the same. That is, it marks it to interact in inference and action guidance in an appropriate way. A unicept could be thought of as a tiny developed faculty. It's designed for a very specific purpose. It's designed for the purpose of collecting and integrating information about some one particular thing, ready for certain theoretical or practical uses. Our unicepts, I believe, are the fundamental units of cognition, forming, for example, the fundamental components of empirical beliefs. But this part is important, particularly important for this conference, I guess. A unicept is not a concept on any traditional reading of concepts. It is a unicept is a particular, it's a tiny developed individual system, presumably a neural network of some kind, devoted to tracking incoming information concerning some particular thing. No two persons have the same unicept. A unicept is an individual person's faculty, perhaps never repeated in another individual in exactly the same form. So similarities between two persons' unicepts of the same thing can never be taken for granted. Always remember Helen Keller, whose various ways of identifying almost everything were nearly disjoint from your own. She graduated from Radcliffe. She could think of 90% of the things you can think of. If not, that's because they were invented since she died, right? She thought of them. If you think of how she got information about them, almost entirely that was disjoint from the way in which you managed to do it. So, all right. So quickly then, how thoughts connect with language, and this is the end. How then are unicepts connected with language? One person might be able to tell vitamin C by the taste, another by the color, shape, and markings on the pill, a third by qualitative analysis. But surely there are other people like me who can only tell by reading the label on the bottle. It says vitamin C. Similarly, I may identify the color of a thing by hearing a sentence containing the word red, find out what its color is. Extensional terms, my claim then, are merely inputs for unicepts. My unicept for vitamin C includes my ability to recognize information about vitamin C by reading a label that says vitamin C. My unicept for red includes my ability to recognize that things are red by believing what I am told by people using the word red, and so forth. As adults, very many of our unicepts involve abilities to identify things in context through prior recognition of words or descriptions carrying information about these things. But if two people have unicepts of the very same thing, and they could also recognize incoming information about that thing by the very same word. They seem to speak the language about that thing. They name the thing the same thing. Still, that does not strictly entail any further similarities between their unicepts. Those are two similarities, doesn't entail any more. Extensional words need not correspond to across people who use them competently to psychological similarities of any kind. Not to similar or even to overlapping input methods, not to similar or even overlapping inferential patterns or output methods. Think of this. Children are almost never taught input methods nor inferential connections for the words they learn. Average kids learn 45,000 words in the first 16 years. It's the average American school children, not college bound or anything. That's about 8 words a day. What the language learner is offered is mainly just words in linguistic and pragmatic context. But this is crucial. Words, of course, that are embodied in a language whose phonological structure they have mastered. This is important. The phonological structure enables them to recognize when they are re-encountering the same word again, and given context with the same meaning. They can tell when it has the same meaning, the same word with the same meaning. This foundational capacity applied to a new word, just taken by itself, already constitutes a rudimentary unicept. Why? Because it is a capacity to recognize when new information is being received about the same thing again, in this case through language. Right? Typically, children then have to figure out on their own how to fill out their unicepts that have been acquired in this manner. That is, how to recognize the reference of their extensional terms in various other ways. But there are an awful lot of things that we know about and think about that we are completely unable to recognize in any other way, that we are completely unable to recognize by sight, by sound, etc. Many, many things that we know about that we know about really only through language. But, okay, almost done. All right, in an extensional term, then, my claim has much to do with a bare this, said while pointing to something. This, taken by itself, carries no information. This is anaphoric on the thing pointed to. It's an understanding of the nature of the thing that's pointed to. The hearer has to grasp independently. Similarly, when typical extensional terms are used, the route from speaker use to hearer understanding is wholly indirect. It passes mandatorily through the hearer's understanding of the world. It is essentially mediated by the idiosyncratic manner in which the hearer has independently come to grasp that structure, the structure of the clump or whatever's being named. Independently come to grasp that, grasp the thing that is pointed at by the name. So understanding of meaning and understanding of the contingent structures of the world to which the words are anchored, these are completely fused. So you cannot prize them apart. They are not layered. Your understanding of meaning and your understanding of the structure of the world cannot be pried apart. That's all.
So we'll now take about 10 or so minutes for questions, and I'll just work my way through. So starting with James.
So this is just a clarificatory question. I thought I understood you as saying that all of the different possibilities like some computer or processor are going to be gathered together in 90%. Is that correct?
No, they're not in there together. There's a difference between the information that you get and your way of knowing how to differentiate about this thing. So I mean, it does turn out that when you learn new ways to recognize, often you belong with learning new information about, and learning new information about will help you with new ways to recognize. But they are separated.
But
the way to recognize what you know or what you know about the thing.
Okay, I'm thinking about just informative dynamics. So, for example, you might have two ways of thinking about the same thing and not practice their thoughts about the same thing. So you have two use sets.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, that's exactly the beauty of it. Very easily you can understand the fragrance. Yeah, I have two use sets. I'm going to information about both. Second information about the same thing. But I'm not doing much.
So you said that the unit sets come with standard conceptions of concepts or standard views of concepts.
Yeah.
Well, what about the view on which concepts are abilities? So you might think, well, the reason we have unit sets that represent certain clusters or clumps is because those particular clumps support a specific set of abilities, and that's why they're useful. Mm-hmm. So on that view, would you think that unit sets approximate certain concepts?
I've said myself flat out that what I'm calling unit sets are universal concepts. So if you read my earlier work, it's just that I decided this was becoming more and more confusing thing. It was just, I just decided the other thing to change concept. Nobody means the same thing as anybody else, but besides which, all right. So yes, as a matter of fact, I had originally said that, I think it was pretty crude, that what empirical concepts are abilities. And I can turn that over here and say, yes, there's a sense in which what a unicept is an ability to re-identify over time information when something is coming in for practical or theoretical use. Yeah. So if you like it, it's a little faculty. What's a little faculty? It's an ability to do something, and the mechanism whose job is to do that. Yeah, exactly.
Andy?
It made me start thinking about the conditions of possibilities for construction of the unit. So you started to talk of the picture of diverse plots, spread out in the time. But it seems like to me, if you turn up the magnification of 100 plots, what you find is sort of complementary property that nearby points in space and time tend to be similar to each other. And I suspect if you can start unit sets that way. If you can imagine the university was there were somehow diverse plots adding up in application nearby points in space and time that were similar to each other. I don't think you get rid of it.
I'm not sure this is an answer to that in my book, but let me do this.
Jake?
I was wondering why you think that there are no definitions for kinds. So if a kind is just a sort of region in this multidimensional space, and the axes of the space are just given by different properties, why isn't the definition for a kind just given by that particular space, just being somewhere in the region that you associate?
Yeah. It's what you mean by definition is the way you can pick them out. I could just say, well, you know what? I'll give you the definition. It's this guy and all his progeny and all his ancestors. Is that a definition?
I don't know. So
it's that kind of way. It's a clock. Which clock is that? Has a definition. The things that are in the clock, you don't count them as in the clock. The rest of it is the clock. It's not just in the like each other. It's that they're like each other. And so you could kind of talk about them in essence, and the essence is we were helping together and make them feel like, and for animals, we have to do that. Dogs discovered as very common, have to do lineages and not forms. So in that sense, I wouldn't be happy about saying in a sense much. Yeah.
In the back with the blue? Yeah.
I'm wondering if you think on sort of word meaning, how basically words that have meanings are directed from the world. What do you think about words that really don't have anything? So like if it's raining, in there, which is a language you don't pronounce. Or like if sentences like it seems John is sleeping. It seems to mean the same thing as John seems to be sleeping. So whether about it just doesn't mean it. So like what's that kind of stuff?
I just said it. I'm going to come close to you.
So for you, what we're seeing is that we sort of got very good perception of it, and got some sort of vision of it. But what about words that don't seem to mean anything? Like words like it, we say it's raining, or it seems John is sleeping means the same thing as John seems to be sleeping.
This is one thing else. I mean, in a way, those are the kinds of things. Probably, what we people meant by concept is just whatever you have to learn to use a word. So that, or the concept is, concept hurrah, or whatever. And that is my own view of language. The first thing you should think about is what is memory. Only sometimes it's not memory. Reference to the extensions and so that part of it. Look at the truth. Words and extensions. Yeah. That's a little bit worse too. That's a whole different language.
We call you back to the question from
So I'm assuming that these concepts are applied and they're relative to individual.
Yes.
And then one of the things that concepts might do is account for individual subjects that my ability to track and data across time. And so I'm wondering with these uniceps, how is it that they're going to be able to track the same entity across time, given that it seems to be a cache out in terms of areas of
I think it's not actually possible to track an individual across time. Is that what makes an individual is that it hangs on over the property of the individual. That it stays the same.
But one of the concepts is that across time, as an individual, a lot of the properties are changing. So one of the things that concepts are supposed to do is explain how we're tracking this entity, this thing. Given these changes in geological structure across time. So the worry is that it's part of the language, or if it's applied entity, how would it account for incremental appearance across that individual, given that the object of the reference object might not be across time.
changes some of the,
It will be an analysis.
it will be, yeah.
Just wondering how we can set an account for processes like that.
Although the users themselves, because they're writing on the and what I'm saying is they manage to write on the as a matter of fact, most of the hospitals remain human. People process and enough time to be able to keep track of them as they change and stuff. That's what I don't know. I thought he had knowledge. They're trying to write a book, particularly so space or something. I guess I would say that's not the book that I'm talking about, and in response to that, real structure kind of talking about that
We have a question in the front from Ruth.
Yeah, so my view on the most striking lens in making is the idea that the function of words and I guess concepts is not to draw boundaries between times, but to track. Now that's really striking, at least for one respect, and that's a brilliant one, but most of psychology and concept learning. So, yeah, it's really about actually learning how to do boundaries between. So there's an obvious tension between what they do and what you think the function of concepts is. But so that's just an observation. But here's this question. Now, according to your view, it's a little bit striking that boundaries are so salient in thought, right? So boundaries between kinds have a tremendous impact on our psychological life. For example, there's categorical perception, right? So when things we don't define. So to define kind, phonology, perception, it has a tremendous impact on our intuition about similarity. It's not only about the level of phonology, it's about the level of concept and words. So when different languages have classified the colors in different ways, it has an impact on their perception of colors, according to some studies anyway. Right? So it's a little bit puzzling why boundaries seem to be so salient if really concepts don't really draw boundaries between kinds.
I kind of think that all of the cases really is the boundaries between the yeah. It's funny, I have to go back. You know, when I think security is terrible, showing pictures, line drawing, and saying, is this the glass or the big system? So and they're trying to figure out where the boundaries of the concept glass and base is. No, because glass and base is functionalized. The second, you don't find nothing defined by its shape anyway. But yeah, we do a lot of categories because there is a lot of people. There are a lot of people. And one of them saying, yes, the world really does evolve into lovely chunks of categories and stuff. Who loves it? But then, and the reason why we change which is definitely the something there. And the reason we have to have law books that are this thick is because ordinary words are all so big. When you begin to look at odd things, but you turn it down pencil, and you're thinking about just what happens every day. And then there's the outline. And you're it. So then you have to change the law. Change the law and the law is very fast. Exactly because the world itself is not.
So your response to these cases where boundaries seem to matter from psychological point of view are just outliers, and that for most concepts, you wouldn't find any boundary effect between kinds.
We final question from Andy. Remains just to thank Ruth.